Hi, I'm Scott Wilson, and the title of my video is Plant a Garden. So I thought I would go over a few of the reasons why you should plant a garden and why I plant gardens after nearly 40 years. Reason number one that I plant a garden is simply personal satisfaction. I get a great deal of satisfaction out of starting something from seed and nurturing it in a little pot or in the ground and bringing it to fruition and harvesting the crop. It's a very satisfying experience, and it's filled with hope for the future. You can't really plant a seed without having a great sense of hope that this seed will unfold and do its magic in front of you. Another reason to grow a garden is for the relaxation it gives you. Gardening is relaxing and de-stressifying in this stressful world for most people. I find it relaxing for a period of time to just go out in the garden and dig around with a trowel and water plants and start seedlings and harvest vegetables and just generally what you would call puttering around. It's satisfying. Sometimes an hour or two in the garden, there's nothing like it. Since this little presentation is part of the Plastic-Free Eco Challenge, I thought I would address the reasons why it's good to garden from a plastic-free perspective. The first reason, obviously, is when you go to a plant nursery, all of the plants come in plastic 4-packs or 3-inch or 2-inch or 4-inch little containers, or gallon pots or 5-gallon, whatever the container they come in, that's plastic. Of course, you can reuse those things and get many years of use out of them, so it's not as bad as a single-use plastic. But in the long run, they do end up in a landfill somewhere, or worse, kicking down a road, or in a lake, or a stream, or in the ocean, and they begin to degrade into smaller and smaller bits of plastic, as we know. So one reason to grow your own vegetables is you can eliminate the need to bring home starts in plastic containers. Also, when you grow your own vegetables, usually they're right outside your back door or your front door, or maybe on your deck, right outside your window in a container. So the need to get plastic bags to put your produce in is eliminated also. So these single-use plastic bags are a scourge on the landscape if you've been to Mexico or other countries where trash collection isn't as good as in the United States. You'll see a lot of plastic blowing down the road, caught up on cactuses, in creeks and streams. I'm not saying that we don't use as much plastic as anybody, but our trash collection here in the States is better than some other places, so we don't actually see the waste that we're creating because it gets carried away by the trash trucks. These days, another issue that is just starting to come into focus is nanoplastics. And what nanoplastics are, tiny, tiny microscopic sized pieces of plastic from larger plastic objects that break down. But unlike many substances on Earth that have half-lives where they break down into their components, plastics, once they're created, just break down into smaller versions of themselves. So, food security is another reason why growing your own garden is such a great idea. By food security, I mean you get to grow your own food, so you don't have to worry about supply chains or weather in different parts of the country or different parts of the state where you live to determine whether or not you get the vegetables you want. You have the ability to at least attempt to grow the food that you want, and you also avoid transportation hang-ups if there's a strike, if the price of fuel goes up, whatever happens. Your food is more secure if it's right outside your back door versus being trucked what I think the average is 1,000 miles produce and fruit travel from producer to end consumer. Another reason to grow your own garden is your food safety. And by that I mean you get to determine what sort of fertilizers are used on your plants. If you like to use organic fertilizers, then you get to choose what fertilizers go on your vegetables and your fruits. You don't have to use chemical fertilizers if you don't want to, and you don't have to be subjected to other people's chemical fertilizers if you don't want to. Likewise, the pesticide angle is also in your control. Whatever goes on the surface of the fruit is determined by you. Whether or not you want to spray Roundup, it's up to you. I hope you don't, but it's up to you. Whether you're spraying some organic, certified organic, approved fertilizers, that's also up to you. Another great reason to grow your own garden is that you get to choose from a vast variety of vegetables and fruits to grow, especially if you're growing from seed. When you go to the garden center, the amount of starts available is limited, but when you grow from seed, your possibilities expand greatly. There's thousands of different varieties of fruits and vegetables to choose from. We're going to start out with the distinctions of different types of seeds to help you navigate the world of seeds. The first definition we have is organic versus conventional. Organic is a definition that is ruled by the USDA, and you can see on this pack of seeds it says organic here, and then there's a USDA organic label here, and the standards are generally thought of as more beneficial than chemical fertilizers, or what you would call conventional. There's no specific rules of what is conventional, that's just a general term, but organic is a specific set of rules, and it avoids, generally speaking, harmful chemicals and pesticides. So I like to use organic seeds as much as possible. You can see that even Ferry Morse is growing organic seeds. Ferry Morse is a large seed company that a lot of people would consider to be generally conventional, but that's not always the case. You always have to look at the label, because even sometimes big companies that are generally known for being conventional also have organic seeds. So after you have the distinction between organic and conventional, you have some other terminology like heirloom. An heirloom seed is basically a variety that has been passed down through the generations. There's no technical or legal term called heirloom, but when you see heirloom, you can be assured that it is a variety that's probably been passed down for 50, 100 years or more. And one of the more important ideas behind the heirloom is that you can save the seed from an heirloom variety and grow it, and it will produce the same vegetable that you got the seed from. That's not always the case, because here, for example, I have a variety of mustard called Ms. America, and it's an F1. What that is, a hybrid. It's called an F1 hybrid, and two varieties of mustard were bred together. The first generation of seed from that is the F1. It produces a concept called hybrid vigor, and it creates a different vegetable variety, and usually it produces more. It's a more abundant variety. They do that in corn a lot, because an F1 corn hybrid will produce greater yields than an open pollinated or stable heirloom variety. F1 seeds can't be saved and produce the same variety that you grew. For example, if I grew Ms. America, it would grow the vegetables that I see here on the packet. If I let it go to seed and saved that seed, planted it the following year, it would grow mustard, but it would revert to the parent varieties that it was bred from. It won't produce the nice hybrid that I grew this year. It'll produce different varieties. There are ways to stabilize F1 hybrids, and a lot of growers will take an F1 hybrid and stabilize it and turn it back into an heirloom variety what they call an open pollinated variety. In this case, open pollinated means that you can save seed from year to year and get the same results. F1s you can't, open pollinated you can. Heirlooms are generally in the open pollinated category. If you see heirloom, you can rest assured that it's not an F1 hybrid. Here's another variety. It's from Botanical Interests. It's a Helianthus sunflower, 2 different varieties in here, and it also says heirloom. So what this leads me to believe is this variety has been around for a while, and if I grow these guys and save the seeds, I will be able to keep them and grow the same varieties the next year. Some companies, like our neighbors, Siskiyou Seeds, they are 100% organic, 100% open pollinated. So some companies, you can be assured that every variety that they carry are open pollinated and organic, like Siskiyou. These guys here, Territorial Seed Company, they're in Oregon, just up north, about 100 miles from here. They carry mostly organic, but they also carry F1 hybrids. They can carry conventional seeds, and they also carry GMO seeds in some cases. GMO stands for genetically modified organism. And what that means is that at the laboratory level, the scientists take segments of genetic structure from a species and insert it into another species. So you don't know what you're getting, and I generally avoid pretty much at all costs genetically modified organism seeds. Here's one here that's certified organic. It also says non-GMO, and part of organic certification is that genetically modified organisms are not allowed as certified organic. So when you have organic, no GMO. Now I'm going to recap the categories. So the 2 overarching categories are organic and conventional. Organic is a certification that's overseen by the USDA. There are standards and rules and regulations that a farmer person must adhere to be certified organic. Conventional is just a term that is not a legal term, but it's used to signify everything that's not organic. So it's just a broad category. Any pesticides, any chemicals, anything that's not organic is conventional. Organic is generally thought of as being better and probably is in fact safer for the consumption of food, fruit and vegetables, because there are great limitations on what a farmer can use on their crops, directly on the crops and in the soil, and it is healthier, in my opinion, much healthier. So you have organic and conventional, and for seeds, below that, there are categories that can be either conventional or organic, such as F1 hybrids. F1 hybrids, as I mentioned, are 2 parent plants that are bred together. The seed of that is called the F1 hybrid. Well, F1s can also be organic or conventional. Open pollinated seeds, likewise, can be conventional or organic. Open pollinated seeds can be saved and grown again the next year, and you will get the same vegetable. Genetically modified organisms can never be certified organic, so GMOs will always be conventional. Heirlooms are open pollinated seeds, essentially. They're a subcategory of open pollinated, and that just means that just like a family heirloom, they've been around a while. They're generally thought to have been around 50, 100, 150 or more years. So one thing I want to mention about open pollinated seeds is that while it is true that you can save open pollinated seeds and they will grow true to type, you have to make sure that the pollen that is pollinating the flowers is from the same variety. This is easy in varieties like beans and peppers, and it's very difficult for varieties like cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, and melons. Those are notoriously known to crossbreed with other varieties and other species of similar vegetables. So those are better left to people that have more knowledge about seed saving. but it's worth knowing. You can go online also and find out which varieties are easier to save for seed and which are more difficult. In many cases, the commercial seed growers that are growing those varieties of cucumbers, melons, and squashes will have fields that are isolated by miles so that no bees cross-pollinate the seed crops from different varieties that may be growing in the area. So just keep that in mind when you're saving your seeds. All right. An easy thing to do to see what your soil is like is to do a shake test. All you need is a jar, preferably a quart or larger, and a trowel or a shovel or your hands. If your area has leaves and sticks in it, like a place that's never been cultivated before, you'll want to clear away the leaves and sticks to get down to where the duff or the organic matter that hasn't decomposed transitions to where the organic matter is decomposed or definitely beginning to decompose. And below that will be the soil. So you start out, after you get the sticks and twigs, leaves out, get a little bit of dirt from the top, go down 6 or 8 inches to get a little sample of what it's like down below. You want it to be about 1/2 or 3/4 full. And then you go fill it with water and shake it. The next step, after you get your jar full of soil, is to add water. So I've got my hose here, and I will add water until it's filled to the top. Okay, I put the lid on, and now is the fun part. Get to shake it and make sure all the water is mixed in with the soil. And kids love doing this part. If there's any kids in the garden, let them do it because they love making mud pies. You want to make sure that you get it all mixed up really well, because our goal here is to allow it to settle and make sure you get it really well shaken up. And if you have a larger jar, it's a lot easier. Say if you have a gallon jar and you put the same amount of soil that I put in this jar here, you'll have a lot more water for it to mix in with and then slowly settle down. What happens is the soil particles settle down at different rates. The heavier pieces go to the bottom more quickly. The lighter, more fine pieces stay suspended longer, so they will settle on top. So what you get is you'll get a picture of coarse, medium, and fine, and you'll be able to get an idea of what your soil is composed of, and that will give you an idea also of what you need to use to amend your soil to make it more ideal for gardening. Here we have our soil shake test ready to look at. I've made a mark here and here with a Sharpie. From the bottom to the first mark is our sand layer. From that mark to the next mark in the middle is our silt layer. And from this mark to the top is our clay layer. There are 3 components to a soil: sand, silt, and clay. The sand layer on our property is nearly non-existent, as you can see in this video. You can't really even see much of a difference between the sand and the silt layer. The silt layer to the clay layer you can see quite distinctly. It's a little bit lighter in color and much finer in texture. the ideal composition of your loam is 40-40-20. 40% sand, 40% silt, 20% clay. As you can see here, we're a little bit off the mark. We have maybe 30% sand, about 50% silt, and maybe about 20% clay. So it's a little bit off, but it's not bad. It doesn't really matter that much. And if your soil is not ideal in the loam structure, don't let that stop you from gardening. Like with this and this, our silt and our clay, what we have in our garden is the tendency to crust over after we water overhead a few times. It makes it a little more difficult for the water to penetrate because it forms a crust, that is easily mitigated in a small garden by simply going through with a hoe, or you can get a little cultivator tool and just gently break the soil crust up until Since the title of this presentation is Plant a Garden, I thought it was time now to plant a garden. So I'm going to make a 2x2 foot garden right here in front of us. The tools I will be using are a shovel and a digging fork. I will be adding some composted chicken manure, which is the bag on the left, and some potting soil, which is the bag on the right. You could do this garden with just a shovel if you had to. Oh, and I'm also going to use a pick to clear out some of the grass in the 2x2 foot area. So this is going to be a little time-lapse picture of planting a small garden. The first thing I'll do is measure out a 2 foot by 2 foot space. I'll use the pick to loosen up the soil and make the boundary. And if you don't have a pick, you can use a shovel. We have rocky soil here, so if I hit a rock, I just move the shovel until I can find a spot where there's no rock. I waited about 30 minutes for the water to soak in. Now I will remove the corner stakes and see what we have here. This is Gardner and Bloom brand composted chicken manure, so that this is acceptable for use in organic agriculture. So now that I've got this bag of composted chicken manure open, I read the directions on the back and it said to mix a 1 to 2 inch layer of chicken manure into the top 6 inches of soil. So I don't have any gloves with me, so I will just put a layer on top. I waited about 10 or 15 minutes to let the water soak in, and now I'm going to dig it again. Now I'll smooth the top of the bed out with a trowel. can do it with your hand also, just like this. Okay. Since it's the 1st of July today, it's a little late to be planting some of the varieties like beans or peppers, eggplant, any of those varieties that need a long, hot growing season. So all of these vegetables I have here are relatively fast maturing. A mesclun mix of greens, which is a short season. Cilantro, which is about 30 or 40 days. These turnips, 46 days. Butterhead lettuce, 54 days. And French breakfast radishes, 25 days. So in our clay soil, I'm going to show you a trick I use when I direct seed so that the soil doesn't crust over. It's much more difficult to keep the soil moist when the seeds are germinating, when the soil crusts over. So I have a little trick that I use, potting soil. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 varieties. So I'll start off on the edge right here. I'll make a little line. To make a little furrow. And then I'll put some potting soil in the bottom of the furrow. And then with the side of my hand, I'll pack it down. And this makes a nice firm bed for the seed to go on. So I'll take these radishes. And I will plant them just a couple inches apart, maybe an inch apart. The rule of thumb for covering seeds when you plant them directly is to cover them with as much soil as they are wide. In this case, radishes are about 1/16 of an inch wide. So you don't need to cover them with very much soil. So I'll go ahead and just do a little handful like that. Hey buddy, how you doing, little pup? Okay, there's our radishes. Next, I'll plant some cilantro. I'll plant some lettuce now. Some room, so I'll plant the turnips next. These are pretty small seeds too, so I don't want to plant them too thickly. Sometimes it's hard to get them evenly spaced when they're so dinky. So I'll go ahead and cover those with just a thin layer of soil also. Okay, and finally I'm planting Mistisanza o miscuglio di insalata. These are all mostly like lettuce looking seeds, little guys. Little flat, long guys. And same deal with these. Each one of these plants will get quite large. I mean, literally, a chicory plant would almost fill this entire 2 square foot garden. Greens. All right, so there we have it. Our 5 rows in a 2 square foot bed. Or it's 2 by 2, so it's a 4 square foot bed. And finally, I'll water it. The nice thing about this potting soil is that it takes on water and it drains pretty well, but it retains a nice amount. So during the summer, You can hit it with a little water in the morning and again in the evening, and it will stay nice and moist. And there we have it. There's our 4 square foot garden, 2 feet by 2 feet. We planted 5 rows of relatively quickly growing vegetables in there. So today's July 1st. By the 25th of July, we should be getting our first radishes. And then the first couple of weeks of August, we'll be getting the other things. So you can keep doing little garden beds like this and plant them in succession as the season progresses. You know, by the end of July and into August, we can start planting some cool season crops. You start them at the end of July, roughly, and they become seedlings, and you pop them in the ground or plant them directly. And then by the time September, October, or November roll around, you have some nice cool season vegetables that will become sweeter as the nights grow cooler. If you don't have a place in the ground to grow a garden, don't worry. You can always plant a container garden. This garden here I planted on a patio in an industrial neighborhood in Spain when we lived there. All of the soil was scavenged, as were all of the containers. I got the seeds from different places and ended up having a very thriving garden in an industrial patio in Spain. So if you don't have a place in the ground to plant your garden, go up and get yourself some containers and some soil and make yourself a container garden. Now we're going to do a little walkthrough of the garden and talk about pest control. Our first stop here is at our potato patch, or part of our potato patch. You can see here upon closer inspection that this plant has been decimated by earwigs. Normally earwigs aren't a big problem in most people's yards. They generally pick up debris and keep the garden clean. But for some reason this year, our property has had an explosion of earwig, and there are thousands of earwigs. So our main method of control has been just coming out in the garden at night when they come out and squishing them with our hands. Physical control is one way. That's the way I always tend to do it. Really, quite frankly, I'm lazy when it comes to spraying things or such methods. I know it works, and especially if you're a farmer that has a crop they need to grow and sell, that makes sense. But being a home gardener, I tend to just do my best by squishing bugs. Corn, luckily, in its growing stage, the stalk parts don't have too many pests, but once the ears grow, we get some corn earworms, and again, we just physically go around and pull the corn earworms out of the ends of the ears of corn, and they don't usually bore into it. There's different kinds, but around here, we don't generally get too much corn pest. The beans here too were suffering greatly from earwig damage. You can see in here where plants were completely munched on by earwigs, mainly because they were next to this patch of potatoes, which, as you can see, has also been munched on by earwigs, but not as bad as that other patch I showed you. Now that the beans are going pretty well, they've gotten past the danger stage of earwigs, and we hope that the earwig population now has reached its peak and is going down. These guys here are, let me take a look, summer squash. They get some beetles on them, spotted cucumber and striped cucumber beetles. And those generally eat the flowers, but we haven't seen too many out here this year. There's a few. Not too bad though. Here's a patch of kale and cabbage. Cabbage worms are occasionally a problem, and not this year though. This year the only thing that's really been a problem has been earwigs eating everything. And for a while they were munching on the leaves. You can see down here, this is all earwig damage. What else have we got? We've got some cucumber vines here. You can see these leaves were munched on by earwigs also, but the plant itself is starting to pick up steam, so it should be okay. These cucumbers are doing okay. The tomatoes, the worst pest we have on tomatoes is the hornworm, which comes around once the tomatoes are growing bigger. I mean, these are pretty good sized plants, but we haven't seen any pests except, again, earwigs earlier. They were totally munching these leaves at the bottom, which is strange because most things don't even like tomato plants. We have some summer squash here. Okay. These are the little yellow crookneck varieties. These are doing really well. And we've got some other, this kind of zucchini, and these are doing really well. The flowers do get munched on a bit by the cucumber beetles. I mean the spotted cucumber beetles and the striped cucumber beetles. This was a patch here of mustard. It still is. We're letting it go to seed, and we'll scatter the seed around. This also had been damaged heavily by earwigs, but now the seed pods are just about mature, so we will pull these plants out once we get the seeds, and we will amend it and probably leave it until later on this season and plant some fall crop like beets or maybe some cabbages or something like that. This is a little patch of beets here. A few different kinds of beets that have been getting hit pretty good by the earwigs also, but they should do okay. I need to get in here and thin them out. I usually, if I'm using any sort of pesticide to battle insect pests, I use safer soap, which covers the insect's exoskeleton in a film and it suffocates them. Also neem oil for things like aphids and mites. When you get those, that works pretty well. And occasionally any of the kind that have pyrethrins or pyrethrums, which are derived from marigolds. Those are good too for certain pests. But generally speaking, the less pesticide, organic or otherwise, the better. Plus, like I said, I'm just a little bit on the lazy side, and my whole method for dealing with pests is to plant a lot of different things in small quantities and try to work on my soil and quality organic fertilizer as much as possible. And that way, if one plant suffers a loss for whatever reason, the other plants don't suffer a giant loss also. So I kind of hedge my bets by spreading the risk out over many different types of plants. Now I'm going to talk for a few minutes about some of the fertilizers that we use in our garden. One fertilizer I like to use in the garden is composted chicken manure. It's OMRI listed, which means it's good to use in organic agriculture. The nice thing about composted chicken manure is that it's a slow release nitrogen, so that when you mix it into your soil, it releases slowly over time and feeds your plants continuously. Here's a bag of feather meal that's 1200. So it has 12% nitrogen and 0 potassium phosphorus. Here it gives the description, but the main thing that is interesting here is that it provides a steady release of nitrogen for optimum plant growth. This company here, Down to Earth, is one that I use quite a bit. It's also listed for organic agriculture. Here's another Down to Earth product called BioLive, and it's 542, which is a nice general purpose balanced fertilizer to use on vegetables and fruits throughout the season. Here's another fertilizer that I like to use. It's Alaska Fish Fertilizer, and it's 511, and it's also acceptable for organic farming. And as it says, it's great for all indoor and outdoor plants, and it won't burn. To finish off this webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about food preservation and things you can do with your produce if you have too much and you can't eat it all while it's fresh. My favorite food preservation book right now is the Noma Guide to Fermentation. It's the most up-to-date and thoroughly researched book on the market right now. There's lots of different recipes from lacto-fermented all the way down to black fruits and vegetables, making misos, shoyu, garum, all sorts of cool stuff. The lacto-fermented fruits and vegetables is a really good place for any beginner to start, because that's your sauerkrauts and your kimchis fall into that family, and it's a really good way to preserve your bounty when you can't eat it all fresh. Or another book by Sandor Katz is The Art of Fermentation. This is less scientific but more inspirational. I mean, there's plenty of science in it, but he advocates for just go for it and try stuff out. In fact, that's the way a lot of new recipes come about, is by just throwing caution to the wind, within reason of course, and going for it and seeing what happens. So these are two of my favorite books right now for fermentation. And here are a few products of my fermentation. This was some bok choy that I grew earlier in the spring, and it was just growing too much and it started going to seed. So I picked a bunch of it and fermented it in the style of kimchi. This was some mustard greens. I did the same thing. Had a large patch of mustard that was just starting to go to seed. You know, the sprouts were starting to shoot up. So I made some kimchi. This here, turnip tops from July, almost a year old, July 15th, 2019. I said these were turnip tops, but then upon closer inspection, I remembered that I preserved the entire turnip. What I did last summer was take some turnips and cut them like that and pack them full of salt for a day or two to make sure that the salt got in there really well. And then I packed the entire turnip into the jars in a nice spiral, so as they went up the jar, they spiraled their way up. And as you can see, I tasted a piece of it, and it's quite delicious. Like that. Nice. Spicy, and the greens are all intact. And it's pretty good. Of course, you can can things. This is pear sauce. There's some quince in there. And there's a bunch of jams. We also like to dry fruit and vegetables. And there's a lot of different ways to preserve your bounty. These are just a few of them. This one is interesting because I took quince, which is a fruit related to apples, and I sliced it and I put it in a brine. And this was made right after Christmas, 12/29/2019. And it is just as good as the day I put it in there. And it's a salty product, but it still smells and tastes like fresh quince. So I can use pieces of this in sauteed vegetables or in a stew, and it adds a nice quince flavor, and these guys are preserved perfectly. So this was an experiment from last year, and I will probably do some more next year. These are some preserved zebra lemons, and they were from a tree down at my parents' house in California. And these were just packed in salt. And you can see there's quite a bit of liquid that exuded from the lemons, and it smells and tastes really good. Of course, it's extremely salty, and that preserves it. But when you put these into a stew, or a soup, or whatever dish, you just be careful about adding extra salt to the dish, and usually the salt from these guys will provide all the salt you need for the dish. So here's another way of preserving with salt. So there's lots of different ways to preserve your summer's bounty, and don't be shy with experimenting. It's a lot of fun.